Welcome to today's webinar, Where Synthetic Biology Can Deliver Real Value, a Season for Pragmatism. My name is Kristen Marshall, Associate Research Director here at Lux, and I will be moderating today's session. Presenting today is my colleague Bailey Schott, Senior Research Associate. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we will get to any questions that all the questions that we can. But if your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to reach out to us at questions@luxresearchinc.com and we will respond. Also, if at any point you experience any technical difficulties, such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser and check that your internet connection is strong. Now, let's jump into today's presentation. Take it away, Bailey.
Perfect. Thanks, Kristen, and thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time. So kicking us off, the goal for this webinar is really pretty straightforward. We want to identify which synthetic biology applications can deliver real value today and which continue to struggle. But I want to start with a quote that captured a lot of the industry's mindset during the last funding peak in 2021. So Jason Kelly, the CEO of Ginkgo Bioworks, compared building synthetic biology platforms to building apps. He suggested that some will be successful, some won't, and that you don't necessarily need to predict every winner if your platform is strong enough. The idea here was that even one or two great apps keeps the App Store growing. But there are two important limitations to this analogy, right? First, building synthetic biology platforms requires a bit more resources than building a software app. So each project requires that initial development stage, scale up, downstream processing, qualification, and then navigating regulatory pathways. That can make unsuccessful bets far more expensive. Secondly, we've seen very few repeatable commercial wins over the last few years. And that reality has forced even some of these leading platforms like Ginkgo Bioworks to pivot their strategies. So with that said, in an increasingly capital constrained environment, we really need to be much more strategic about which apps we put in the App Store, right? And identify which synthetic biology application areas are structurally positioned to succeed. So that brings us to the central question for today. What applications make the most sense? That is to say, which actually justify the cost and complexity of synthetic biology. And to answer that, we'll start by grounding the main application areas we see today, and then walk through the strengths and weaknesses of each, supported by real examples, and then we'll close with some concrete takeaways. So when we look across the current developer landscape, most synthetic biology companies cluster into at least one of these 5 buckets. We have food ingredients, specialty chemicals, intermediate chemicals and polymers, as well as apparel and fuels. So some companies span more than one, but these are ultimately the most common end market groupings we see targeted today. So what we did next was take a step back, right, and ask ourselves, when companies target these applications, are there consistent strengths and weaknesses that show up? And how can those patterns help us explain where synbio tends to succeed versus where it tends to struggle? So to answer that, we took a structured look at the startup landscape and scored a set of companies consistently across technical and business criteria. So looking at a set of 50 companies scored consistently across those criteria, we color-coded each by application, which you'll see in that key down there at the bottom. And you'll also see on the vertical axis is technical value. Essentially, does the technology solve a real problem in a differentiated way? And is it even technically credible? On the horizontal axis is business execution. So things like, the startup's ability to grow, partnership activity, momentum, and the strength of regulatory drivers. And we wanted to use this data ultimately to visualize broader application level patterns. So for example, where food ingredient companies tend to cluster relative to, let's say, fuels companies, or whether one application tends to show stronger technical value, but consistently struggles on business execution. So once we had these individual data points, the next step was to convert the scatter plot into something we could compare a bit more directly across applications. So we took the same scores you're seeing here, grouped by application, and averaged them to create these sort of application level profiles. So this slide is really the bridge between that individual startup scoring and the application takeaways. What we did was, for each of these application buckets, we averaged the startup scores across each scorecard criteria, and then we color-coded each cell relative to the overall synbio average, giving us this lovely heat map that looks a bit like a turtle shell. So when you see a darker shade, that's an area where the average company in that application tends to score above the overall synbio baseline, and lighter shades are areas that tend to score a bit below average. So the goal is to make strengths and weaknesses visible at a glance, not just whether an application is attractive, but why it tends to look stronger or weaker when you pressure test it across the same criteria. So with that framing in place, we can now walk through each application in the same way. First, going through what kinds of products and molecules developers are targeting. Second, the key strengths and weaknesses that show up in the scoring. And finally, a case study that illustrates how those dynamics play out in practice. So let's start with food ingredients, right? Because it's one of the earliest and most visible areas where synthetic biology tried to establish commercial traction. Companies here are targeting things like alternative proteins and fats, functional health ingredients, flavors and additives, as well as sweeteners. And food really attracted a lot of initial activity because demand is massive and the value proposition is pretty intuitive, right? Better nutrition, as well as addressing food insecurity and supply issues. Now, on the strength side, food ingredients benefit from established fermentation infrastructure and clear demand pull in certain categories. But on the other hand, a lot of these markets are really competitive and approval timelines can be quite slow, which means that even if the technology works, companies can struggle to access the market fast enough to build that momentum and generate revenue. And even though food is a huge market overall, what many companies can realistically access, especially at some of those premium prices, is much narrower. So overall, one of the clearest patterns we see in food is this early excitement, heavy investment, and then that demand reality and competition hitting a bit harder than expected. And Perfect Day is a company that really illustrates that dynamic. This company scaled quickly, raised a significant amount of funding based on the promise of synbio-enabled dairy proteins. But in practice, their growth was constrained by competition, demand miscalculation, and the challenge of sustaining a meaningful price premium in an already crowded landscape. So even when the product performs, which Perfect Day's dairy proteins did, when customer adoption didn't take off as they projected, some of those execution risks compounded quickly. So food shows us an important lesson. Visibility and theoretical market size don't automatically translate into accessible market opportunity, particularly in sectors like food with pretty unforgiving margins. And as it became clear that synbio could be pretty expensive to implement, the industry naturally gravitated toward high value targets where pricing could, in theory, absorb some of those higher production costs. And as a result, many developers have moved into the specialty chemical space, targeting things like biosurfactants, cosmetics, and personal care products, where customers really care about performance. And for this reason, specialty chemicals can look like the obvious answer. There's a real technology value here, partly because platforms can diversify across many end markets, and molecules can be achieved by many different production routes. But the recurring constraint is execution. Some of these less mature management teams entered these markets assuming that specialty margins would be easier, and they leaned too heavily into consumer storytelling rather than aligning with what their true customers, other businesses, actually needed. To the contrary, startups that prioritize early validation partnerships, demand-dependent scale-up, and integration into existing value chains are better positioned to succeed. So Capra Biosciences is a good example of a scale-up approach that aligns with the realities of specialty markets. Instead of building one large pilot from the jump, they built many smaller continuous fermentation reactors that they can turn on and off based on demand for their retinol. That allows them to serve sampling and early customer needs without carrying oversized or idle capacity. It's a practical way to de-risk scale-up by aligning output volume and demand signals before committing to larger infrastructure. And this strategy actually landed them purchasing agreements for their entire pilot facility of retinol production last year. So in specialty chemicals, the ultimate lesson is engage startups that prioritize those B2B needs and existing demand, letting corporate players lead the consumer storytelling. So the next category is intermediate chemicals and polymers. This certainly wasn't a target for the first era of synbio developers. Most people didn't initially hear synbio is expensive and think, oh, let's make intermediates. But this category can be compelling when it's targeted correctly because intermediates often integrate into established value chains, and in the right situations, external drivers can create a real opening. So the key strength here is that developers can create value through process innovation and by making some of those drop-in intermediates that feed multiple downstream markets. But the challenge is not every intermediate is worth pursuing. The best targets tend to be ones where underlying market or policy drivers are creating a sense of urgency, things like restrictions on certain chemicals or supply volatility presenting those strong drivers. And Kristen, I think you actually summed it up perfectly when we've talked about this before. You said intermediates are attractive as long as you're mindful of what's creating that opening. So acrylic acid is an interesting example of a market where that kind of opening is being created, right? So acrylic acid has been targeted for a long time as a synbio opportunity, and it's not just because it's a large market. Upstream, acrylic acid is tied to propylene, so volatility in propylene supply chains ultimately creates interest in alternate routes that could reduce exposure to some of that price swing. Now, downstream acrylic acid is used in products like superabsorbent polymers, including absorbent hygiene products and baby diapers, where there's strong interest in safety and bio-based content, at least from a consumer perception and branding standpoint. But it's also been really difficult to crack technically. Prior routes have often involved unstable intermediates, which create operational headaches, which is why industrial microbes approach is a really interesting example, because it uses P3HP as an intermediate, which is a more stable and soluble alternative to 3-HPA, the intermediate used in more traditional routes. And this ultimately reduces operational complexity on that path toward acrylic acid derivatives. So the key takeaway here is that alternate intermediate strategies can create real value when they reduce some of that downstream operational friction and align with external market drivers. Now, moving into apparel, this was another one of those early beachhead markets for synbio. It was largely driven by the kind of excitement and visibility of creating novel materials. And initially, many developers here targeted protein-based fibers like spider silk or animal-free leathers, which were really compelling, right? Because garments are consumer facing, the storytelling is easy to communicate from a marketing standpoint. It's very similar to what we've seen in food. But the challenge is that accessing this market in practice has been much harder than the earlier hype would have suggested. The constraint that dominates apparel is the price premium problem. Materials developers have really struggled to enter some of these high volume markets because the unit cost parity just hasn't been achievable. And without that, adoption stays limited to small collections or niche premium launches. But at the same time, we really do see partnership activity and an appetite for solutions in apparel. Increasingly, that appetite is shifting away from some of those novel fibers and more toward improvement in things that reduce cost or resource use within the manufacturing or finishing processes themselves. So the takeaway for apparel is really, if you can't eliminate the unit premium, you have to make the value proposition work through cost and use. And Octarine Bio is a good illustration of that cost in use strategy. So this company makes highly concentrated dyes that work universally on different fiber types. So the dyes themselves are not cheaper per unit, but their performance can reduce the number of dye cycles and water required for a typical dyeing process. So even though the dye itself contains a premium, dye houses can see really meaningful savings in total water, time, and processing. And those savings can offset the unit per unit price premium. So ultimately, this is the kind of story that can work in apparel right now, reducing friction for a key value chain partner without requiring that full shift into a completely new material. And last is fuels. So this is where synbio offers a path to replacing one of the most resource-intensive industries in the world through solutions like bioethanol, sustainable aviation fuels, and biofuel intermediates. And the impact that biofuels can have is evident here. In terms of technical value, they are by far the strongest applications on all fronts. They really can meet some of those stringent performance standards, but cost remains a challenge. It's also where execution barriers are often the most severe, and they can really dominate the opportunity in the near term. So in fuels, companies face very long approval and certification timelines, and for things like sustainable aviation fuels, that can easily span 5 to 10 years. That's a major hurdle on the path to commercialization. There's also a structural revenue challenge, right? So to sell fuels, you typically need to be producing at volumes that are worth buying, which creates what we've sort of joked as the most deadly of all valleys of death, because it's difficult to generate meaningful revenue until you've already reached and financed a very large scale production platform. So for fuels, it's certainly not about a lack of technical prowess, but it's more about how unforgiving the execution environment can really be. And Global Bioenergies is a great example of this because this is a startup that did a lot by the books. It had a really strong technology platform, it showed scale-up progress, and it raised funds. It also attempted an incremental strategy where they explored non-fuel markets as a bridge while scaling. And in theory, that's a reasonable approach and one that's frankly necessary with 10-year certification cycles. But unfortunately, it still wasn't enough. The core fuel scale-up, capital intensity, and certification challenges remained. And the company's final pivot to long-lasting cosmetics left it struggling to move past those barriers, ultimately shutting down operations in 2025. So the message here is that incremental steps are often necessary, but they don't guarantee success. And if you pick the wrong bridge market, you can really dilute focus without solving that structural revenue problem. So hopefully walking through these examples has made it clear that placing synthetic biology bets requires a bit more strategy than just mass launching apps in an app store. And just because you can make something with synthetic biology doesn't mean you should. The technology itself can be impressive, but market structure, execution constraints, and timing ultimately determine whether it can become a repeatable commercial win. So we'll close with a few takeaways, both at the application level and from a broader industry perspective. One high-level learning from this work is that the criteria don't all weigh equally. So things like solution value and addressable market are important signals of long-term opportunity, but near-term commercial success is most often dictated by business execution, especially barriers to growth and regulatory drivers. And the second learning is that these dynamics look different depending on the application. So for food ingredients, we really want to avoid segments like alternative meat proteins where overcrowding and slow approval timelines are not likely to resolve anytime soon. But for some categories, things like health ingredients like lactoferrin and food colorants, demand is clear and that performance is sustained. So these are areas which still show promise. The key really is to prioritize clear regulatory paths and proven demand across the food sector. Now, for specialty chemicals, these should be treated more as midterm targets, with engagement strategies focused on areas where incumbent chemistries are already facing real challenges. So specifically look for situations where policy or supply-driven reformulation is already underway, and be cautious with novelty and consumer-led drivers because ultimately the B2B fundamentals still dominate whether these can scale. Now for intermediates and polymers, it's important to prioritize drop-in substitution where you can deliver efficiency or cost and use advantages without rewiring the entire value chain. We want to be really careful here about overextending into downstream markets a bit too early because a clear and targeted focus is necessary to avoid overcomplicating things and burning cash along the way. Now for apparel, we want to avoid novelty as a standalone value proposition, which has been the core strategy for products like Spider Silk textiles. Premium pricing has consistently blocked high volume adoption, and novelty alone just simply cannot overcome that. The more actionable opportunity right now is solving textile processing inefficiencies. Things like dyes and finishing chemistries are strong examples, especially if regulatory pressure on synthetic dyes continues to expand. And finally, with fuels, we want to view some of these leading platforms in this space as long-term opportunities, typically a 10 to 15-year value horizon. So SAF mandates and credits have passed the point of no return in markets like the EU, but success really depends on building resilience through co-product strategies and early certification planning, not just relying on temporary subsidies. And finally, sort of zooming out to three broader industry takeaways. The first is that industry conservatism is dominating adoption right now. And what this means is even clear performance advantages often aren't enough if the switch to a bio-based product requires disruptive formulation. And because of this, incremental low-risk improvements are the priority today. The second thing to keep in mind is that regional flexibility really matters. Regulations will continue to shift with geopolitics, making some of those stable, more uniform incentives that we might hope for pretty unlikely in the near term. So the survivors of this constrained capital environment are going to be those that reduce costs through process innovation and regional diversification. And the third and final thing to remember is that the most promising startups are going to be those that focus on B2B drivers. Past failures have shown us that chasing volatile consumer trends don't sustain synbio ventures for long. And instead, the strongest partnerships are going to be those in which startups are prioritizing some of these early cost, quality, and supply standards while letting the brands handle the consumer storytelling down the line. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for your time. And Kristen, I'll hand it back over to you for some questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Bailey. We will now be taking questions from the audience. So please feel free to type any questions that you have on the presentation into the questions box on your screen. And if we do not get to your question on this call, someone from Lux will be in touch after the webinar. Okay. I think we can start with this one. How can large corporations work with startups to ensure more successful outcomes for these technologies? So, we've seen past challenges in this space, but how can large players play a role, and any lessons that you can share there?
Yeah, so what we're consistently seeing is that earlier engagement is leading to better outcomes. So we expand on this a little bit in a recent news signals brief, but essentially recent partnership activity over the last year is showing us that when corporates engage earlier, they have a real influence on what gets prioritized. So that can mean helping narrow the target market, or shaping performance requirements, or steering the technology toward applications that actually fit within their existing value chains. So the benefit really is access to some of these earlier and more innovative technologies, but also in some cases exclusivity. And I think, the challenge is if we wait until a technology is fully mature, there's a good chance that someone else has maybe already partnered or guided that development in a different direction. And this is especially relevant for companies where there's that strong, rationale to engage bio-based solutions like beauty or consumer goods players that have some of that pressure to decarbonize. So some examples are companies like Lululemon or L'Oreal, right? They have really strong track records of these early startup engagements. And it's not just about innovation scouting for them, right? It's about actively shaping viable alternatives before the platforms and markets crystallize.
Okay, and just kind of like piggybacking off of that question in your response, how would you go about de-risking those partnerships? What would be some of the ways that you've seen?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it's one that I hear a lot of from both sides, right? So, from the corporate side, the concern is often, we don't want to spend on sampling with no guaranteed return. And from the startup side, the reality is they often can't afford to give away samples at a loss when funding is already tight. But there are a few ways to bridge this gap. So I think the first major one is just capital alignment. Startups naturally have a bit more flexibility to provide samples at a lower cost when they're backed by recent funding. So in some cases, even just taking a minority investment alongside a tech collaboration can really reduce friction on both sides. But another thing, and one I think people don't think about a lot, is leveraging these public-private partnership structures. So organizations like BioMade in the US can organize and support some of these early trials, as well as other government programs that explicitly foster those type of public-private pilots. And sometimes these organizations will even bring in universities or national labs to support these collaborations, which ultimately can reduce risk, broaden the technical support base.
Okay. And I think we have time for one more question, and this is an interesting one. So you mentioned earlier, a case study on global bioenergies and their unfortunate fate this past year. What would have been a better path for them to maybe have seen a different fate? I think it's a little bit more of a challenging one too.
Yeah. I think we mentioned, right, that where things really became strained for them was in how they tried to bridge the gap to revenue while navigating that sort of lengthy certification cycle, scale up cycle. And the move into long lasting cosmetics, I think it was really well intentioned, but it didn't really reinforce their long term position in the fuels value chain that they were ultimately trying to serve. So, maybe a more robust strategy could have been something closer to what we see with platforms like Synbio, right? Where producing bio oils or intermediates that can plug into existing fuels pathways, like SAF or bio-naphtha streams, basically create that interim opportunity in an adjacent value chain. So that kind of a co-product or intermediate strategy, it certainly doesn't eliminate the risk, but it does keep the technical development aligned with the end market that you're trying to reach. And I think in contrast, stepping into adjacent consumer markets can dilute focus and absorb a lot of capital without de-risking that kind of core fuels, structural revenue challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and certainly less of a risk than launching your own cosmetic line,
Sure.
for sure. Well, thanks so much, Bailey. That concludes our webinar for today. The slide presentation and recording from the webinar will be sent to all attendees via email. So after leaving the webinar, you're going to be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation. We would very much appreciate any feedback that you have, and this only goes to help inform and improve future webinars. And please take a moment to check out our upcoming webinars. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a great day.